Hi everybody. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about the 20th century civil rights movement. One of the things that when we think about the civil rights movement, one of the things that we tend to do is to sort of remember it as Martin Luther King only, and remember it as this unified front going forward that was extremely successful and that got all of these changes made. So that's not really what the historical reality is, because there were actually quite a few different groups, sometimes working at odds over what they wanted to do and how they wanted to accomplish it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about its origins, where it came from, and why it started when it did. And then we'll also get into the different phases of the civil rights movement. And there are really three relatively distinct phases. And I've got the times listed here, the dates. Those are not set in stone. It's not like in 1960 exactly, the change happened. But there were some kind of differences in who was working, what they were working for, and what methods that they wanted to do and what they accomplished. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the accomplishments or limitations of the civil rights movement as a whole, which are also really important to think about. Okay, so for themes, a couple of things. One of the things that I want you to be thinking of as we go through all of this, again, is the different phases of the movement, that this was not a unified movement with everyone working toward one goal. There was a lot of opposition, obviously, as well. So pay attention to the different phases and who was active and what they wanted and how they were trying to go about doing that. In addition, what you should be paying attention to is the role of the federal government here, and the role of state and local governments. Because for the most part, they could be helpful sometimes, and they could be very harmful sometimes. Bear in mind that we do have a federal system. We have the national government, and then we also have local and state government underneath that. We have the three branches of government: judicial, executive, legislative, and so we'll be mentioning those as we go through, and just be paying attention to who's doing what government-wise, because that's kind of important. Okay. Let's look at the origins of the civil rights movement, where it came from and why it started when it did. So there are two things that happened in the 1940s that are really going to spur the civil rights movement, and they're interrelated. One of the big things that happened in the 1940s was urbanization. As y'all may know, for some time in the 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, blacks had been migrating to cities. This had started after the Civil War, but it's going to become a lot more pronounced around World War II. Black people are going to be moving to cities, and particularly moving out of the South as well, but they're moving to cities in the South too. But this was happening in both the North and the South. Blacks were moving to cities and moving out of rural agricultural existence. Again, mostly more into the North, also into the West quite a bit. So a lot of African Americans are moving to places like California, for example. One of the things that happens when you have a lot more people moving into urban areas, particularly out of the South, it's going to make it a lot harder to see who is black and who is white. In close-knit, small rural areas, everybody knew everybody else. So, that was not an issue. You knew if someone was black. And by the way, of course, the definition was if you had a drop of black blood, you were black. In the city, when you come in, you're a lot more anonymous. And some blacks were able to pass much easier. In some cities, of course, it's going to be much more expensive to deal with segregation and Jim Crow. Just having two of everything everywhere is going to cost a whole lot more. Most importantly, though, as we see blacks moving into cities, And remember, they were segregated, and even in the North, they were in segregated areas. But blacks were able to develop a sense of community. They were able to develop a sense of solidarity in a way, because they were forced into these areas. And not only that, but they were in these areas in big enough numbers that, and without that sort of oppressive system of the South of keeping them from voting, they are now going to be able to vote legally, usually without fear of being hung for it. And they're also voting in high enough numbers to have some clout, okay? So they were coming in and they were being segregated, but one advantage of that was that they had this very concentrated area where their voting power had some voice and it had some strength. And they were able to make politicians force them to care about issues that they cared about. So it wasn't just that there were Southern issues. These are going to be issues that turn into national issues. So urbanization is something that is really, because of World War II and the need to have people in those industries with a lot of men off to war, building things like tanks and airplanes and all that, urbanization is going to be really something that brings blacks into cities, especially in the West and up in the North. World War II itself was also really important in giving a push to the civil rights movement. It was important in a lot of different ways. The first thing that World War II did was it delegitimized racism. And all that means is it made racism look bad. We were fighting during World War II, Germany and Hitler, and of course Hitler with his ideas of racial superiority of whites was the enemy. And his slaughter of millions of innocent people during the Holocaust put those ideas of Aryan superiority, of racial superiority of whites, at the very worst end of society in many people's minds. So the first thing, because we were fighting Hitler, it made racism look bad. Many Americans felt that we were fighting against racism. Also very important, a lot of African Americans, you can see some pictures here of the Tuskegee Airmen, many African Americans experienced military service during the war, and this is going to change them in very important ways. First, they're going to gain new confidence in themselves and their ability to do things. They're going to gain new skills as they work in the military. More importantly, for the civil rights movement, certainly, they're going to gain expectations of what their country is supposed to do for them. I mean, basically, these people go into the armed services, and they realize that they are willing to and going to be risking their lives for their country and fighting for their country. And when they come back from World War II, they are going to believe very strongly that, hey, it is now time for you to pay that bill. It's time for our country to start doing something for us. So World War II and urbanization are related, but they're really going to be this spur where we see black people coming together as bigger political entities within cities and having some political clout, but also having that confidence and that sort of motivation to really begin to push. So, the background of this first phase, which runs from about 1954 to 1960, there's a very long history of the civil rights movement, which we won't really get into a whole lot. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, we had begun to see the development of independent black leaders. So people like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida Wells Barnett. So black people are going to begin to have a political voice even 50 years before the civil rights movement got started. The problem, though, was that the South is really going to clamp down on African Americans and try to make sure that those amendments that got passed after the Civil War, guaranteeing black men the right to vote, guaranteeing them citizenship, freeing slaves, they're going to try to make sure that those things are minimized as much as they possibly can. And so this is where we get Jim Crow laws, where the South is physically separating the races. We have a lot of laws that come out poll taxes and grandfather clauses, which were basically where they were trying to restrict the right to vote. They would make you pay to vote. They would make you take some sort of written exam to vote. And of course, black people in the late 1800s didn't have any money. Education had been outlawed under slavery for black people, for slaves. So, those kinds of things on their face may not have seemed like they were discriminatory, but they really were. So and certainly as well, extra-legal violence was rampant. There were lynchings throughout the South of African Americans who stepped out of line. So these kinds of restrictions and oppression that the South put on African Americans was really pretty stifling and hard to get around. So it's going to take that impetus of something like World War II to kind of break that a little bit and to show some cracks so that we can get in. People could get in. One of the groups that really started to attack a lot of this early on and beginning in the early 1900s was the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the NAACP really started to attack particularly that issue of segregation. Segregation had been established as a firm legal case in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which had been decided by the Supreme Court. And that case of Plessy versus Ferguson decided that segregation was okay as long as the facilities were, and you've probably heard this term, quote unquote, separate but equal. So the NAACP really began to sort of work at this idea of separate but equal as the standard. And of course, what was happening was, number one, sometimes there weren't even facilities for blacks. So it wasn't separate but equal, they just weren't there. But even when there were separate facilities, of course, they weren't equal. One of the ways that the NAACP began to be very successful at chipping away at this was at education. And so they began in the early 20th century to kind of chip away at this, at education, because it was sort of an easy target. Graduate level education, they went after first, and that was kind of an easy target because things like law schools, medical schools, they had a white branch, but they didn't have a black branch at all. So, there wasn't even a case of separate but equal. So, they were able to sort of begin to make some progress with requiring graduate level education for African Americans. They also started to have legal cases trying to get black teachers equal pay, all kinds of other sorts of things. So in the early 1900s, from when they were founded in the early 1900s to around the 1940s, the NAACP was filing cases and chipping away. This is a long process, though. It's a long, slow process. The culmination of all of this work is going to be a case called Brown versus Board of Education, which the Supreme Court decided in 1954. Up to this point, this was the most significant legal victory. So Brown involved, it was a bunch of cases that were kind of bundled together. They were cases that African American parents had brought in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas. And what the parents were angry about was that certainly Kansas had segregated schools, grade schools, and they were furious about the inequality between the schools themselves. The black school was not funded as well as the white school, but what they were also angry about was the conditions that the kids had to go through in order to get to school. So one of the things that they noticed was that the white kids were close to their schools. It was easy for them and safe for them to walk to school. For the black children, they often had this very long, hazardous walk, and you can see this picture of a couple of young black girls walking along a railroad track, which, by the way, was really active and busy. This was how they got to school, and it was dangerous. And so parents were reacting to all of these kinds of situations, these problems within Kansas schools. And they were arguing basically again that this was not separate but equal, and that the segregation of schools should be overturned. And in this case, the Supreme Court in 1954, with the Brown decision, agreed to them and basically struck down the Plessy decision in this. So, Brown said, and you do have to be kind of careful with legal cases because they are very specific and only sort of tailored to what the immediate cause is for the case. So the Brown case actually said it struck down segregation, but this was only about public schools. So they said that segregation in public schools is no longer okay, that schools need to work toward desegregation. And this was an immense victory. It was a really, really big deal, and it is going to just cause a huge ripple effect with activism. So what we're going to do, we'll stop there, and we will get back into sort of how Brown galvanizes activists and begins pushing them into the first phase of the modern civil rights movement.